1 tablespoon of plain cooked rice pressed gently into ordinary garden soil. 24 hours later, a delicate white web of fungal threads begins spreading across the surface. 48 hours after that, earthworms start rising at dawn, drawn from every corner of the yard toward that single, unremarkable handful of rice. No fertilizer, no chemicals, no expensive amendment from the garden center, no pelletized concentrate, no mail-order microbe blend, no bright blue liquid plant food, just rice. By the end of the first week, the soil where that rice landed will look visibly darker, crumblier, and more alive than the earth around it. Plant roots reach toward it, worm trails cluster around it, and all of it began with a single spoonful from last night's dinner. What unfolds in the hours after rice meets living soil is one of the quietest, most extraordinary biological events on any backyard plot in America. And for reasons rooted in 10,000 years of farming tradition, a tradition older than most of the continent's modern cities, this humble grain behaves less like food and more like the oldest currency the soil has ever traded in. 5 rice techniques, every one of them backed by peer-reviewed science, every one of them costing less than a cup of coffee. And by the end of this video, the way any seasoned gardener looks at the pantry will never be quite the same again. The real engine beneath every healthy garden. Before the 5 techniques come into focus, one truth has to land first, because without it, none of the rest makes sense. Earthworms are not optional residents of a healthy garden. They are the engine. In 2014, Dr. Jan Willem van Groeningen and his team published a landmark meta-analysis in the journal Scientific Reports, drawing on 58 controlled studies from more than a century of global field research. The finding was unambiguous. When earthworms are present in agricultural soil, crop yields climb by an average of 25%. Above-ground plant biomass rises by 23%. Translated into a backyard vegetable patch, a 25% gain is the difference between a handful of tomatoes and a full basket. Every single week, all summer long. It is the difference between peppers that struggle and peppers that overflow the harvest bowl, and it is achieved without adding a single dollar's worth of synthetic input. 9 years later, in 2023, Dr. Stephen Fonte of Colorado State University went further. Publishing in Nature Communications, his team calculated that earthworms quietly contribute to roughly 6.5% of global grain production, 140 million metric tons of food every single year. That is more cereal than Russia, one of the largest agricultural nations on Earth, produces in a 12-month span. And every ton of it comes from creatures no one has to buy, feed, vaccinate, or manage. But here is the detail most gardening books skip entirely. Earthworms do not eat soil. They do not eat roots. They do not eat fertilizer. They eat the microscopic bacteria and fungi that coat decomposing organic matter. Tiny cells so small that a teaspoon of healthy soil can contain more of them than there are human beings on the planet. More microbes mean more worms. More worms mean richer soil. More soil richness means vegetables that grow the way the old catalogs used to promise. And almost nothing on Earth feeds soil microbes as quickly, as cleanly, or as cheaply as a handful of rice. So the question becomes, what exactly does the pantry hold that most of modern agriculture has overlooked? 5 answers, beginning with the one that works the fastest. 1. The cooked rice catalyst, the fast-acting worm magnet. Why does a single spoonful of leftover cooked rice trigger a microbial explosion that no bottle of liquid fertilizer can match? The answer sits inside the rice grain itself. Raw rice is built from starch locked into tight, crystalline structures, compact little fortresses that resist quick breakdown. Cooking changes everything. Heat and water pry those fortresses open, a process scientists call gelatinization, and suddenly every soil microbe in the neighborhood has access to a pre-digested feast. Within 24 to 48 hours of being pressed into garden soil, bacteria and fungi swarm that grain. A pale white web of fungal mycelium rises toward the surface, fine, cottony threads that spread in visible branching patterns, like frost climbing a window pane in reverse. And here is the aha moment most gardeners never see coming. The earthworms do not come for the rice. They come for the microbial bloom the rice creates. To a worm, that fungal web is a signal flare visible across an entire garden bed. Application is almost disappointingly simple. Scatter 2 to 3 tablespoons of plain unseasoned cooked rice across each square foot of soil. Press it lightly into the top inch, not deep, just enough to keep it in contact with moist earth. Cover with a thin layer of mulch to protect it from drying out and from curious birds. White rice, brown rice, jasmine, basmati, day-old leftover rice from the refrigerator. Any of it works, as long as it is plain. Timing matters. The technique performs best in warmer months, when soil temperatures stay above 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Below that threshold, microbial activity slows, and the bloom takes longer to appear. Spring through early autumn is the ideal window. A single application every 2 to 3 weeks keeps the biological momentum going without overwhelming the soil. But here's the mistake even experienced gardeners make. More is not better. Pile too much cooked rice into one spot and the microbes consume oxygen faster than the soil can replace it. The result is an anaerobic pocket, sour-smelling, slimy, and actively hostile to roots. The rule is simple. Thin layers, spread wide, never heaped. And here's the second mistake. One that catches even careful gardeners off guard. Leftover rice from restaurants or takeout containers often carries salt, oil, sesame, soy sauce, or chicken stock. None of those belong in a garden bed. Salt draws water out of soil microbes and kills them on contact. Oil coats the grain and blocks the very microbial colonization the technique depends on. Only plain, unseasoned rice, cooked in nothing but water, should ever touch living soil. And here is the detail rarely shared in gardening magazines. A single tablespoon of plain rice fuels a biological cascade that most commercial liquid fertilizers cannot replicate, because those products feed plants directly while bypassing the living soil food web entirely. The rice technique works in the opposite direction. It builds the biology first and lets the biology feed the plants the way nature has always done. Cooked rice feeds the soil beautifully for a week, sometimes 2. But what happens when winter settles in and the microbes need something that lasts far longer? 2. Crushed uncooked rice, the slow-release winter feeder. There is a myth every new gardener eventually absorbs, that soil dies in winter. It does not. Soil life slows, hibernates, retreats deeper, but it does not die. And the gardeners who feed that sleeping biology through the cold months are the same gardeners whose spring beds erupt while everyone else is still waiting on the frost. This is where raw rice earns its place. Uncooked rice holds on to its crystalline starch the way cooked rice cannot. Those locked-in structures take weeks, sometimes months, for soil microbes to unwind. That is the whole point. A light crushing, a rolling pin across a tea towel, or a few quick pulses in a blender cracks the grains open without reducing them to flour. Here is the common mistake. Fine flour is not the goal. Flour compacts, suffocates the soil, and turns into a pasty layer that blocks oxygen for weeks. The target is cracked grain, never powder. Hundreds of tiny, slow-release capsules, each one a pantry for the microbes that will eventually feed the worms. Worked into the top 2 inches of soil before the first hard frost, crushed raw rice becomes a seasonal food supply for the subterranean world. Moisture seeps in, starches leak out. Microbes feed at a steady, patient pace through the coldest weeks of the year. 1 cup of crushed raw rice, worked into roughly 10 square feet of garden bed, is enough to carry the soil biology through an entire New England winter. Storage is worth a quick word. Crushed raw rice keeps indefinitely in a sealed glass jar on a pantry shelf. Unlike flour, it does not attract pantry moths. Unlike cooked rice, it does not spoil. A single 10-pound bag of cheap long-grain rice bought once can amend every bed on the property for 2 or 3 winters running. The science backs this up without ambiguity. A 2016 study in the International Journal of Environmental Health Engineering documented that adding raw rice residues to earthworm systems produced faster stabilizing, nutrient-richer vermicompost, with measurable gains in nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. The rice did not just feed the worms, it changed the chemistry of the compost the worms produced. And here is the detail rarely mentioned. Gardeners who crush raw rice into their beds in November routinely find thriving earthworm populations under the snow by February. Not dormant. Working. The heat generated by microbial activity around each cracked grain keeps a thin envelope of soil above freezing, even in deep cold. which means that by the time spring rains soften the earth, the soil is already churned, aerated, and primed for explosive growth. One common mistake deserves a final warning. Never try to broadcast crushed rice across soil that is already frozen solid. The grains sit on the surface, attract hungry birds and mice, and accomplish nothing. The technique belongs to late autumn, when soil is cool and damp but still workable, not to midwinter. But solid rice, whether cooked or raw, works on the timescale of weeks and months. What if the most dramatic microbial boost of all comes not from the grain, but from the water most kitchens pour straight down the drain? 3. Fermented rice water, the liquid microbial accelerator. Every household that has ever rinsed rice before cooking has, without knowing it, created one of the most potent liquid bio-inoculants known to traditional agriculture. And almost every household has poured it straight down the sink. That cloudy, chalky-looking water carries dissolved starches, B vitamins, amino acids, phosphorus, potassium, and a handful of trace minerals. Left alone in a clean glass jar at room temperature for 2 to 3 days, covered loosely with a cloth or paper towel, never sealed airtight, it ferments. Lactic acid bacteria, the same microbial family that turns milk into yogurt and cabbage into sauerkraut, multiply rapidly, dropping the pH and transforming that cloudy rinse into a concentrated microbial drench. A ready ferment sends its own quiet signals. A faint sour smell, clean and almost bread-like. A scattering of tiny bubbles rising slowly from the bottom of the jar. A slight separation in the liquid, with a little cloudiness settling toward the base. These are the signs of healthy lactic fermentation. The exact same signals a sourdough baker watches for in a morning starter. A 2021 study in the journal Sustainability, led by researchers Abba Nabai and Christopher Te at University Putra, Malaysia, confirmed what farmers across Asia have known for centuries. A 3-day fermentation period dramatically increases beneficial bacterial populations and raises soluble nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Their follow-up trials in 2023 showed measurable gains in nitrogen-fixing bacteria, phosphorus-solubilizing organisms, and overall plant growth. The Western scientific world arrived at this conclusion only in the last decade. The Eastern farming tradition arrived there a very long time ago. Dr. Taro Higa of the University of the Ryukyus in Japan pioneered the formal study of effective microorganisms. Master Han Kyu Cho, widely recognized as the father of Korean natural farming, built an entire agricultural philosophy around fermented inputs and indigenous microbial communities, a system now studied at universities from Seoul to Cornell. Here is the application most videos get wrong. The finished ferment should smell mildly sour, almost like a sourdough starter. Never sharp, never putrid, never alcoholic. Dilute 1 part fermented rice water to 10 parts fresh, non-chlorinated water. Pour around the base of plants, never on the leaves. Apply every 7 to 10 days during active growing months. And here is a detail rarely shared. The water used to rinse the rice in the first place matters more than most gardeners realize. Hot tap water can denature some of the B vitamins and starches before they ever reach the ferment. Cold or room temperature water, run briefly over the rice, captures the cloudiness that makes the whole technique work. And here's the common mistake. Leaving the ferment to sit for 5, 6, 7 days does not make it stronger. It slides past beneficial lactic acid fermentation and into rot, producing compounds that can actually damage tender young roots. 3 days, 4 in cool weather, is the window. After that, compost it and start again. Open garden beds respond beautifully to fermented rice water, but inside the closed world of a worm bin, where every variable is controlled and every input counts twice, rice does something even more remarkable. 4. Rice in the worm bin, the population multiplier. For anyone keeping a backyard worm bin, this next technique arrives with numbers sharp enough to stop any gardener in their tracks. A 2018 study in the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health tested rice residues against ordinary bin inputs. The findings were striking. Earthworm body weight climbed, biomass rose, mortality dropped, in some trials, dramatically. A 2020 study in Peer J pushed the measurement further, documenting that earthworms completely consumed rice residues within 4 weeks, while enzyme activity across multiple nutrient cycling pathways surged. The translation is simple. Rice does not just feed worms. Rice multiplies them. The mechanism is the same one that drives the first two techniques, concentrated inside the closed container of a bin. A few tablespoons of leftover cooked rice, or a small handful of crushed raw rice, added alongside the usual kitchen scraps, triggers a microbial bloom inside the bedding. The red wigglers, Eisenia fetida, the species most American home bins use, feed on that bloom, not on the rice itself. Their castings come out darker, denser, and more biologically active. The difference is visible to the naked eye. Castings from a rice-fed bin take on a rich, almost espresso dark tone, with a smooth, almost buttery texture when rubbed between the fingers. Standard castings, by comparison, often look coarser and grayer. That visual difference is the worms telling their keeper, in the only language they have, that the microbial community has shifted. And here is the secret worm bin veterans rarely share publicly. Rice added once a week in small amounts produces visibly heavier castings within 30 days. Return to the garden bed. Those castings carry the microbial community of the bin along with them, effectively seeding the soil with a living, working population of decomposers. One backyard worm bin, fed rice on a regular schedule, can inoculate an entire vegetable garden. New bins, less than 3 months old, respond more dramatically than established ones because the microbial ecosystem inside is still setting itself up. A new bin fed a tablespoon of cooked rice per week often reaches full production 2 to 3 months earlier than a bin fed only standard scraps. The common mistake in the worm bin is straightforward. Never add rice to bedding that is already too wet. The added starch ferments in the wrong direction and the bin turns sour overnight, producing a sharp, vinegar-like smell that drives worms toward the surface seeking escape. The fix is just as straightforward. Keep the bedding at the dampness of a wrung-out sponge. Add rice in thin sprinkles, never in clumps. Bury it under an inch of bedding to keep fruit flies away. And never ever add seasoned or oiled leftovers. The same rule from the garden bed applies with even more force inside a closed container. The grain itself transforms the soil. But there is one part of the rice plant that has almost nothing to do with feeding microbes at all. It solves a problem every gardener with heavy clay soil has quietly battled for years. 5. Rice hulls. The soil structure transformer. Every ton of rice milled produces roughly 200 pounds of hulls. Worldwide, that adds up to tens of millions of tons of what most of the industry treats as waste. For the gardener who understands soil structure, that same hull is one of the most underrated amendments on the planet. Rice hulls are roughly 20% silica by dry weight. They are tough, lightweight, slow to break down, and almost impossible to compact. Folded into heavy clay soil, they physically pry apart the dense particles, opening in tiny channels that oxygen, water, and roots can all move through. Folded into a potting mix, they accomplish everything perlite does: drainage, aeration, structure, without the one detail rarely featured on a perlite bag. Perlite is a strip-mined volcanic mineral. Once it leaves the earth, it does not return. Rice hulls, by contrast, regrow every single year, in every rice paddy on earth. There is also a price difference worth noting. A large bag of rice hulls purchased from a feed store or a brewing supply shop typically costs a fraction of what the same volume of perlite sells for at a garden center. For gardeners amending multiple raised beds or mixing their own potting soil in bulk, that difference adds up to real money over a single season. The silica matters beyond structure. As the hulls slowly break down across a growing season, dissolved silica becomes available to plant roots. Plants that take up silica build stronger cell walls, resist sucking insects, aphids, thrips, mites, far more effectively, and handle drought stress with visibly less wilt. Tomatoes grown in hull-amended soil often stand straighter. Peppers resist blossom end rot more reliably. Even lawns respond, greening up more evenly through late summer heat. For heavy clay soil, the proportion is worth learning. Spread 1 part rice hulls to 4 parts soil across the top 6 inches of a bed. Work it in with a garden fork, and the transformation becomes noticeable within a single season. Water that used to pool on the surface begins to drain properly. Earthworm channels reappear. Seedlings that struggled in the same spot the year before begin to thrive. Here is the detail worth knowing before the first bag is poured. American gardeners should look specifically for parboiled rice hulls, often sold under the abbreviation PBH. Raw, unprocessed hulls can still contain viable rice seed, and more than one gardener has been startled to find young rice plants sprouting in a container mix. Parboiled hulls are heat-treated, sterile, and safe to use anywhere, including in seed starting trays where even a single sprouted weed can ruin a whole flat of young seedlings. Spread 2 inches of parboiled rice hulls across a garden bed as surface mulch, and the effect is immediate. Weed seeds cannot germinate without light, and the hulls block it perfectly. Soil temperature stabilizes against the daily swings between cool nights and hot afternoons. Moisture lingers far longer between waterings, often cutting irrigation needs in half during high summer. Microbial life thrives under the insulation, and across the season, the hulls break down quietly into carbon, silica, and trace minerals, feeding the earth instead of sitting in a landfill somewhere. The return of an ancient currency. Every one of these 5 techniques points to the same quiet truth. Rice does not feed plants. Rice feeds the living world beneath the plants, and that living world feeds everything else. Taken together, the 5 methods form a single, coherent strategy. Cooked rice triggers the fastest microbial surge. Crushed raw rice carries the soil through winter. Fermented rice water delivers a concentrated liquid drench. Rice in the worm bin multiplies the microbial power tenfold. And rice hulls rebuild the very architecture of the soil itself. 5 tools, 1 grain, 1 pantry, feeding one enormous, living, underground community. That is what makes rice behave like the oldest currency the soil has ever traded in. Not a fertilizer, not a supplement, a form of payment between the human kitchen and the underground economy that has been running uninterrupted for 10,000 years. The cost is almost nothing. The returns compound every single season, and the gardeners who learn to read this ancient currency stop hauling heavy bags home from the garden center and start looking at the pantry, for the first time in years, with new eyes. The earthworms are waiting, the microbes are hungry. Step out into the sunlight, reach for the rice, and let the soil remember what it has always known.